Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit now about the rise of conservatism in the 1980s. But I want to remind you that that rise of conservatism really has roots in the 60s and 70s. And in many ways, this like Republican resurgence in 1980 that propels Reagan to like political victory is going to be based on the backlash against the incredible social change that had happened in the 60s, against the frustrations with what was seen as like a dilution of American moral authority in the 70s. And it's going to be that backlash that will ultimately result in or support and galvanize voters to favor Republicans in the 1980 election, most of all Reagan. Yes. Yes, it is very much like a second return to normalcy, maybe a third return to normalcy, because the 50s was a bit of a return to normalcy, right? Like we wanted to end those New Deal programs. They didn't want to do any more reform. The Fair Deal, Truman's plan, is like super ineffective. And going back on the unions and all this business. And so then here again in the 80s, we're going to see the same kind of pulling back from all those changes we had seen. So for one thing, I want you to know that the year 1980 really stands out. Why do we start the period in 1980? It really stands out as a time when America is looking for hope, and they find it in many ways in the person of Ronald Reagan. Remember that the 70s are, can we just sum it up, really terrible, right? Nobody wants to go back to the 70s. They didn't even have, it's all bad. Fashion is bad, everything's bad. Anyway, so the 70s are really rough. They're ending on this note of like American shame. We have these hostages in Iran. We can't even get them back. The Soviet Union seems to be growing in power instead of weakening as we had thought. Nobody thought the Cold War was going to last this long. There's just this real sense of anxiety about where America is. Our economy is tanking. All of the oil shocks of the 70s have meant that stagflation has really taken hold, and nobody feels like there's a way to solve that problem. There's just a lot of, I'll just repeat myself, a lot of anxiety at the end of the 70s. And so Reagan has this incredible personality, but he just seems this guy, like he's just going to solve the problem. Here we can draw comparisons to FDR, right? The hopelessness of the 30s, the early 30s. And then here comes FDR who says, we're going to solve this problem, don't you worry. FDR's campaign song was Happy Days Are Here Again, which, seems a little bit ironic, playing across the country in 1931 and 32 when we're all in the depths of a depression. But it's that sense of hope. And Ronald Reagan communicates something very similar. In fact, the day that he is inaugurated, moments after he takes the oath of office, Iran wires over their response, we have released the hostages. And so Reagan gets to claim his first victory literally minutes after assuming the office. And that's going to be a sort of a symbol for the country. So there's a reason that Reagan is a really beloved president in the Republican Party. And really, if we could get ourselves a bit away from the partisan politics of the day, I think that most Democrats would probably admit that Reagan was in many ways a positive thing for our country, even if they don't agree with all the policy decisions that he made. So why do we see this conservative resurgence? Well, I want to talk about some of the organizations. You can see them here. The NRA, for example, which had existed since the 1920s and 30s, but it's going to become a real political force in the 1980s. The Heritage Foundation, focus on the family, and a really, really big one is the so-called moral majority. And the moral majority is led by that guy. His name is Reverend Jerry Falwell. He is an evangelical Christian. He is going to be part of this like televangelist movement. So like television is allowing like pastors to reach audiences and to take like religion to a new level where they're trying to like grab the hearts and minds of the American people. And Jerry Falwell is going to really do a good job of harnessing this frustration. So lots of the things during the 60s and 70s, this frustration with government in general that comes out of the Watergate era, this anxiety over like Americans getting involved in other countries and like losing, like Vietnam just doesn't sit well with the American people. We don't want to be losers. That doesn't seem to be who we are. Lots of the social changes, civil rights to some extent, but in a bigger way, these changes in like the notion of women's rights, the rise of like activism in the LGBT community, just that it seems that America is in this period of transition, morally speaking, and who we thought we were, these traditional values, seems to be sort of slipping out of our grasp, according to Jerry Falwell. And so the moral majority is going to harness this frustration and sort of put it to work for the Republican Party and say, okay, it's the Democrats who seem to have been on the leading these changes. Let's support the Republican. Let's support a new kind of Republican. And this moral majority is going to be really one of the biggest forces to contend with in politics in the 80s. And they're going to be squarely behind Ronald Reagan. And Reagan responds, and the Republicans respond. A good example of that would be the case of Planned Parenthood versus Casey. This is a case that is heard in the 1990s, 1991. But it is heard by a court led by William Rehnquist. His name is on the back there, Rehnquist, William Rehnquist. Rehnquist had been appointed Chief Justice by Ronald Reagan. And it was sort of like Ronald Reagan's goal to undo the damage, so to speak, that Earl Warren and Warren Burger had caused to our country. And the biggest sore spot for the moral majority and evangelical Christians in the country was this decision, Roe versus Wade. So Roe versus Wade had said that all women have the absolute right to an abortion under the so-called substantive due process doctrine, and that no state could in any way stop a woman from getting an abortion anytime in the first or second trimester, and in the third trimester, the only way a state could stop it is if they had provisions for a woman's health, which had to include mental health. So it was pretty strict. Basically, we have to have abortions. States have to allow abortions pretty much across the board. But states had begun to try to fight back, especially conservative states, by creating rules that sort of just put extra steps. So 24-hour waiting periods, parental consent. Women had to view an ultrasound before they could have an abortion. They had to be counseled on adoption and parenting rights before they had an abortion, whatever it was. All these sort of little things. And many believed that those restrictions were going against the Roe v. Wade ruling and should be overturned. But when it gets to the Supreme Court, Rehnquist is the Chief Justice, and he leads the majority and rules in Planned Parenthood versus Casey that, in fact, all of those restrictions are totally fine. That the states can do almost anything they want to regulate abortion so long as they don't, supposedly, create an undue burden, right? And that word he left very broadly defined. Because the only program that Rehnquist strikes down, or that the court under Rehnquist strikes down, is spousal consent. So states can't require a woman's husband to give her permission to have an abortion, because that could stop a woman from getting an abortion if her husband said no. But every other thing the states had come up with was accepted as not creating an undue burden. And in many ways, this is what the right wants. Right? This is what the moral majority is looking for. They want a rolling back of what they saw as this overzealous expansion of American rights. And I would like to comment that in many ways, the moral majority are speaking in a way that should sound familiar to people in the 1600s. Right? When John Winthrop arrives and says we ought to be this this beacon for the rest of the world, this city on a hill. Winthrop in his speech, he argues that we have got to do right by God. We've got to do the right thing. We've got to be moral. We've got to be successful. And if we violate this covenant they're making with God, that may God basically smite us all, right? That if we're not doing the right thing, then we deserve to be punished. We deserve to fall apart. And so many on the right would use this kind of rhetoric that America has got to return to her moral roots, has got to stop pretending that moral relativism is legitimate, and that if not, we're going to continue to see the kinds of decline that we perceived in the 1970s. So Reaganomics, which we spent several days discussing now, was this retreat from Keynesian policy. That hadn't worked. It hadn't solved stagflation. And so Reagan is going to propose this really supply-side approach. So we're going to go to benefiting businesses, benefiting the wealthy, in hope that that's going to help the rest of the economy. And in some ways it does. I'll go ahead first. In some ways it does. Reaganomics is going to help to reduce inflation over the course of the 1980s. They're going to increase employment. They're going to manage to help grow the economy. American GDP grows. But there are certainly exceptions. First of all, although we have employment growing, Most of those jobs are going to come from the low-paying service sector, so things like the restaurant industry, the hotel industry, those kinds of things. Those jobs don't pay a whole lot of money. So there are jobs, but the average wages will actually decline across the country. We are going to see that stagnation in the middle class and the rise of the wealth gap. So there's certainly some caveats to be had. But generally speaking, Reaganomics is going to be successful at the big things that Reagan was suggesting, and will help to propel America through a recession in 81 and 82, into recovery in 83, and a pretty booming economy, frankly, in 1984. Although some might argue that it was defense spending that was driving that growth. Growth is growth, bless you, so far as most people are concerned. Although, you know, the deficit thing. Okay. So in 1984, when Reagan is running for re-election, his biggest question to the American voters is this: are you better off than you were 4 years ago? And if you forget the little hiccup that was 81 and 82, but frankly, we call it a hiccup, it was like the whole 70s was the hiccup before that, then in fact most people were better off. But the economy did seem to be more hopeful, more stable. And Reagan is going to win in a landslide. One more important thing of the 1984 election, however, is that in 1984, the Democratic opponent for Reagan, Walter Mondale, is going to choose as his running mate Geraldine Ferraro. This is the first time that any major party will choose a woman as one of the members of their ticket. So vice president, not president, of course. But the next time that a woman was on the national ticket was 2000 with Sarah Palin alongside John McCain. So, 2004. 8. No, you're right. 2004 were Bush. All right, that's what happens at the end of a long day. Anyway, so it's going to be quite a while before we see. Of course, Mondale and Ferraro don't win, but you know she was on there. Yay. Actually, Palin didn't win either, so there's that. Lots of Y chromosomes. Here we go. Now we're going to spend just a little bit of time considering the foreign policy challenges. But before we do, I'll give you a moment to appreciate this picture because it is highly entertaining. So the USSR, godless communists, liars and spies. Thatcherland, right? Margaret Thatcher was this famed leader for the British, and as Prime Minister, Thatcher is going to be working very closely with the United States. Socialists and pacifists, they're our oil, their China and our China, kangaroos, Republicans and all other real Americans. And then there's California and Ecotopia, environmental freaks and quiche eaters, it appears. Unexplored wasteland, Democrats and welfare bums. There's that. So anyway, Japan Corporation. Here's the Palestinian homeland proposed. There we go. Oh, look, Israel is super large. It does, in fact. I wasn't going to say that one out loud. Our canal. Remember, Jimmy Carter had initiated giving away the canal, right? So that was a bit of contentious issue. The Falklands, which are giant because the British got into a bit of a thing over the Falklands. It looks like it might say Beirut, but that's weird. Anyway, so American foreign policy is going to be in many ways driven by a bit of a superpower worldview. And to be fair, we were a superpower. So we've talked about how Reagan is going to expand military spending on programs like the Strategic Defense Initiative or Star Wars. But there are a lot of other issues that are going to be a bit more challenging. I'm trying to decide which one I want to talk about here. I guess we'll talk about Lebanon and the Iran-Contra affair later. Well, we'll do the Iran-Contra affair. So, never mind, we won't. We'll talk about this tomorrow.